Thomas Reed was closing his workshop for the day when he received an unusual email. Dear Mr. Reed, I found your contact through the Antiquarian Bookbinders Guild. I have my grandmother's childhood book of Hans Christian Andersen tales, printed in Copenhagen in 1924. She brought it with her when she left Denmark in 1939. The book isn't valuable in monetary terms, but it contains something precious, though I'm not entirely sure what. Before she passed away last month at 94, she told me, the book holds the summer of 1939. When you need to remember joy, look between the stories. She was quite insistent that only a traditional bookbinder should restore it. Would you be willing to help? Best regards, Sophia Larsen. Thomas wrote back immediately, intrigued by the gentle mystery in the request. The next morning, a young woman with kind eyes arrived carrying a carefully wrapped package. The binding is falling apart, Sophia explained, watching Thomas unwrap the book. But grandmother always refused to have it repaired. She said it needed to stay exactly as it was until the right time. The book was indeed in poor condition, but Thomas could see it had once been beautiful. The cover bore delicate illustrations of mermaids and sailors, now faded with time. As he carefully opened it, pressed flowers fell from between the pages. Not the usual flat, papery specimens found in old books, but flowers that had been preserved through some unusual method, maintaining their color and dimensionality. These are extraordinary, Thomas said, examining one under his work lamp. I've never seen pressed flowers preserved like this. Sophia leaned closer. That's Arctic bell heather, she said. It only grows in certain parts of Denmark. Grandmother used to talk about a meadow full of it near her childhood home. As Thomas gently turned the pages, he found more flowers, each carefully placed next to specific stories. But there was something else, small annotations in the margins, written in two different hands, like a conversation carried out in pen marks and pressed flowers. Next to the little match girl was written in young, hopeful handwriting, "Remember the sunset by the lighthouse?" Below it, in different handwriting, "The sky was the color of these flowers. Some things time can't fade. H." Sophia watched Thomas examining the notes. "I never knew there were writings in here," she said softly. Grandmother couldn't see well enough to read in her later years. She just held the book and told us stories from memory. The morning light streamed through the workshop windows, catching dust motes and making them dance. Thomas carefully laid out his tools, knowing this restoration would be different from any he'd done before. "Who's H?" he asked gently. Sophia shook her head. "I don't know. Grandmother never spoke about her life in Denmark before coming to America. She would only say that some summers hold enough happiness for a lifetime." Thomas picked up his finest brush to clean the spine. "Well," he said, "it seems this book has a story to tell us." As Thomas worked on cleaning the spine, he noticed a pattern emerging. Each pressed flower was placed with careful intention, not randomly scattered through the pages, but precisely positioned next to specific passages in the stories. "Look at this," he said to Sophia, who had stayed to watch him work. "Next to the Snow Queen, there's a sprig of rosemary, and written beside it, 'For remembrance,' like Ophelia said. Keep this one, E.H." Sophia drew closer. "And here," she pointed to another page, "there's some kind of blue flower next to the Little Mermaid. Forget-me-nots." Thomas identified them. "And see how the notation changes here? The first person, E, wrote in black ink, while H always responded in blue. As they turned each page carefully, the pressed flowers began telling their own story. Heather for solitude, forget-me-nots for true love, rosemary for remembrance, white clover for think of me. It was like discovering a secret language preserved between the pages. Then they found something unexpected. A small pocket had been created in the back binding, cleverly hidden under the end paper. Thomas carefully extracted a folded piece of paper, yellow with age but perfectly preserved. It was a map, hand-drawn in delicate strokes, showing a coastline and a lighthouse. Small X's marked locations along the shore, each labeled with a date and a flower name. The last entry read, August 15th, 1939, where the Arctic bell heather grows. Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she touched the map. I recognized this coastline. It's near Skagen, where my grandmother grew up. The lighthouse is still there. I've seen it in old family photos. Just then, Annie arrived with their morning coffee. Seeing them bent over the book, she set down the cups and peered at the map. Those markings, she said. They look like the old botanical surveys my grandfather used to do. He was a plant collector before the war. Scientists would map out where rare flowers grew, especially species that might have medicinal properties. Thomas studied the map more closely. Indeed, each marking had precise coordinates and notes about soil conditions and blooming times. This was no casual record. It was a scientific document disguised as a romantic memory. Your grandmother, he asked Sophia carefully. Did she ever mention what she did before coming to America? Sophia shook her head. She was only 19 when she left Denmark. All she ever said was that she had worked in a flower shop near the lighthouse. Thomas turned back to the first page of the book, where a dedication was written in faded ink. To Elena, may these tales remind you that the most important discoveries are the ones we keep in our hearts. With love from Henrik. June 1939 inch. Elena, Sophia whispered. That was my grandmother's name. Then H must be Henrik. She paused, looking at the flowers, the map, the careful notations. But who was he? And why did she never speak of him? The morning light caught the preserved flowers, making their colors glow as vibrantly as they must have that summer long ago. Each bloom seemed to hold part of a story waiting to be told. That afternoon, as Thomas carefully reinforced the book's binding, Sophia returned with an old photo album she'd found in her grandmother's attic. I think, she said, laying it on the clean work table, I found something. The album contained photographs of a botanical laboratory, its windows overlooking a lighthouse. In one image, a young woman in a lab coat, presumably Elena, stood among shelves of flowering plants, her smile bright and confident. Behind her, a tall young man was noting something in a journal, his attention focused entirely on his work. That must be Henrik, Thomas said softly, comparing the handwriting visible in the photograph's journal to the blue ink annotations in the book. Sophia pointed to another photo. Look at the date, June 1939, and see what's on the shelves? Arctic bell heather, growing in pots. The next photograph showed Elena and Henrik in a meadow, collecting samples. The lighthouse stood in the background, its white tower stark against dark clouds. On the back was written, Testing new preservation method, success. It wasn't just a flower shop, Sophia realized. It was a research station. They were developing ways to preserve flowers without losing their color and structure. Thomas picked up one of the pressed flowers from the book, examining it under his magnifying glass. That explains why these are so perfectly preserved. They developed some special technique. He paused, noticing something. Look at this. There are tiny numbers written on the back of each flower. They began checking all the flowers, carefully recording the numbers. When arranged by date, they formed coordinates different from the ones on the map. Annie, who had been quietly listening while organizing her coffee cups, suddenly spoke up. My grandfather once told me about a Danish botanical project before the war. They were developing preservation techniques not just for flowers, but for medicinal plants, trying to find ways to maintain their healing properties longer. Sophia sat down heavily in the leather chair. But why hide it in a children's book? And why didn't grandmother ever talk about it? Thomas gently lifted another page, revealing more pressed flowers. Sometimes, he said, the most important discoveries need to be protected. And sometimes, the best way to hide something is to make it look like a love story. He pointed to a particular annotation next to the Snow Queen. Remember, love, science is about patience. Like these flowers, some things take time to reveal their true nature. Sophia ran her fingers over her grandmother's youthful handwriting. The heather is perfect now. The process works. Our garden of healing will bloom forever. I think, Thomas said slowly, your grandmother and Henrik weren't just preserving flowers. They were preserving hope. These plants, they must have had medicinal properties that could be maintained through their special preservation process. As the afternoon light filled the workshop, Thomas carefully continued his restoration work, ensuring each flower and notation remained exactly where it had been placed. The book was more than a collection of fairy tales now. It was a scientific journal in disguise, a love story, and a time capsule all in one. Sophia pulled out her phone. There's someone we need to call, she said. The Botanical Institute in Copenhagen. I think they should know what Elena and Henrik accomplished. But before she could dial, the workshop door chimed. An elderly gentleman stood there, leaning on a cane, his eyes fixed on the book with an expression of wonder. I never thought I'd see this book again, the elderly man said softly, his Danish accent still present after all these years. He made his way slowly to the workbench, eyes bright with unshed tears. My name is Carl Jensen. I was Henrik's assistant that summer of 1939. I was just 16 then. He touched one of the pressed flowers with trembling fingers. Elena and Henrik's preservation method. It worked better than anyone could have imagined. Sophia stood frozen, barely breathing. You knew them both? My grandmother and Henrik. Carl smiled gently. Oh yes, they were brilliant together, Elena with her understanding of plant chemistry, Henrik with his preservation techniques. They were on the verge of something revolutionary, a way to preserve not just the flower's appearance, but their medicinal properties. He pointed to the coordinates they'd discovered. Those aren't just location markers. They're formula notations, cleverly disguised. Each flower in this book contains the key to a different preservation recipe. Elena and Henrik knew war was coming. They wanted to make sure their research wouldn't be lost or misused. Thomas watched as Carl carefully turned the pages, nodding at each flower. But why didn't they publish their findings after the war? He asked. Carl's face softened with old sadness. Henrik insisted Elena leave Denmark in August 1939. He stayed behind to pack up the lab, planning to follow with their research. But then the borders closed. He paused. Elena never knew that Henrik continued their work in secret throughout the occupation, protecting both the flowers and the formulas. Sophia leaned forward. What happened to him? He survived the war, Carl said. But by then, Elena had disappeared into America. He spent years trying to find her, but she had changed her name when she emigrated. He never knew she carried their research with her, hidden in a children's book. Did my grandmother know he survived? Sophia whispered. Carl shook his head. By the time I tracked her down in 1960, she had built a new life. She asked me not to tell Henrik. She said some flowers are meant to bloom just once, but their seeds can travel far. He smiled at the book. She made me promise to wait until the right time to bring these formulas back to light. Thomas looked at the book on his bench with new understanding. All these years, it had been protecting not just pressed flowers and scientific formulas, but the story of two people who had found a way to preserve both love and hope. The preservation method, Carl said, it still has value. Modern medical research could benefit from understanding how they maintained the plant's properties so perfectly. He turned to Sophia. Would you consider sharing their discovery? Both their names could finally be on it together. The afternoon sun streamed through the workshop windows, making the preserved flowers glow as vibrantly as they must have that summer day in 1939. Thomas thought about all the books he'd restored over the years, but none had held a story quite like this, where science and love had found a way to bloom together, preserved between the pages of fairy tales. Sophia picked up one of the perfectly preserved sprigs of Arctic bell heather. I think, she said softly, this is exactly what grandmother meant when she said to look between the stories when I needed to remember joy. A week later, Thomas's workshop had transformed into an impromptu meeting place. On his largest work table, alongside his bookbinding tools, lay carefully organized photographs of each preserved flower, their corresponding formulas now decoded by Carl, and the original map with its mysterious coordinates. Sophia had brought something new, a small leather diary found hidden in her grandmother's desk drawer. I think, she said, opening it carefully, this was meant to be found with the book. The diary began in September 1939, just after Elena arrived in America. The first entry read, Dearest Henrik, I will write to you here, in these pages, everything we would have discovered together, every flower we would have preserved, every formula we would have perfected. Some days I imagine you beside me, still making notes in blue ink. Carl adjusted his glasses, peering at the diary. Elena continued their research, he said with quiet amazement. Look, she found American plants with similar properties. She was adapting their preservation method for new species. Thomas, who had finished restoring the book of fairy tales, noticed something as he compared the diary to the original book. The pressing technique evolved. See how the later flowers in her diary are preserved differently. She kept improving their method. Annie, who had become part of their daily gatherings, brought in a surprise that morning, a pot of Arctic bell heather, grown from seeds she'd ordered from Denmark. The tiny pink flowers looked exactly like the ones preserved in the book. I thought, she said, placing the pot near the restored book, we should have some living flowers to go with the preserved ones. Sophia touched the fresh blooms gently. Carl, you said Henrik continued their research during the war. Do you have his records? The elderly man nodded, patting his worn leather briefcase. Protected by the Danish resistance, then kept safe in the Botanical Institute's archives. He developed techniques for preserving medicinal plants that helped save lives during the occupation. But he always said the method wasn't complete without Elena's understanding of plant chemistry. Thomas watched as Carl laid out Henrik's papers beside Elena's diary. Together, they told the complete story, two scientists, separated by war but working toward the same goal, each preserving not just flowers but hope itself. The remarkable thing, Carl said, studying both sets of notes, is how their research complemented each other even across an ocean. It's as if they knew, somehow, that their work would come together again. Sophia had been quiet, reading through her grandmother's diary. Listen to this entry from 1943. My dearest Henrik, today I found a way to preserve the healing properties in chamomile. I imagine you smiling, making one of your precise notes in the margins. Some days I press flowers not for science, but simply to hold time still, to keep a piece of that summer when all things seemed possible. The morning light streamed through the workshop windows, catching the fresh Arctic bell heather and making it glow just like its preserved ancestors in the book. Thomas thought about time and how some things love, hope, discovery, find ways to preserve themselves, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. I think, he said, carefully closing the restored book of fairy tales, this story isn't ending. It's just beginning to flower in a new season. 3 months later, Thomas's workshop hosted a different kind of gathering. The large window had been cleared of its usual stack of books awaiting repair, making room for Elena's original heather specimens, now carefully mounted in museum-grade preservation frames. Alongside them stood modern attempts at recreating her techniques, each labeled with both the original formula numbers and new botanical classifications. Dr. Marie Larsen from the Copenhagen Botanical Institute stood examining the samples through a magnifying glass. It's extraordinary, she said, her voice filled with quiet amazement. The molecular structure of these preserved plants is unlike anything we've seen. Elena and Henrik were decades ahead of their time. Sophia sat at Thomas's workbench, where she'd been cataloging her grandmother's diary entries. Look at this, she said, pointing to a page dated 1944. Grandmother found a way to preserve willow bark that maintained its pain-relieving properties for years. She was supplying it to local hospitals. Yes, Carl added. And Henrik was doing similar work with calendula in Denmark. Different plants, same principles. He smiled. They truly were two halves of the same scientific mind. Thomas had finished his part in the preservation of Elena and Henrik's work. The book of fairy tales now rested in a custom-made case, each page digitally scanned and its precious specimens photographed from every angle. But he'd grown attached to the story and its daily unfolding in his workshop. Annie arrived with her usual coffee delivery, but today she also brought something special, a small pot of thriving chamomile plants grown from seeds using Elena's cultivation notes. The University Botanical Garden wants to create a special section, she announced. They're calling it the Elena and Henrik Collection. They'll grow all the plants mentioned in their research. Sophia picked up a letter that had arrived that morning from Denmark. The Botanical Institute wants to establish a research grant in their names, she said, for students studying plant preservation techniques. They'll have access to both Elena's and Henrik's complete notes. Your grandmother would have liked that, Carl said softly. She always said the most important part of preservation was passing knowledge forward. Thomas watched the morning light play across the workshop, touching the preserved flowers that had waited so patiently to share their secrets. On his desk lay his next restoration project, an old medical text from the 1940s that someone had mentioned might contain pressed herbs. He smiled, wondering what stories it might hold. "You know," he said, carefully lifting one of Elena's mounted specimens, "books are a bit like these preserved flowers. They hold moments in time, keeping them fresh until the right person comes along to discover them." Sophia opened her grandmother's fairy tale book to the Snow Queen, where the first Arctic bell heather had been found. The preserved flower still held its color perfectly, its tiny bells as pink as the day Elena had carefully placed it there. "Henrik wrote once," Carl said, reading from the old research notes, "some things are worth waiting for, like flowers in winter, or love in wartime, or truth in fairy tales." Outside the workshop window, in a small garden box Annie had installed, fresh Arctic bell heather bloomed beside chamomile and rosemary, growing together just as they had in that long-ago summer by the lighthouse. 1 year later, Thomas stood in a sunlit greenhouse at the Copenhagen Botanical Gardens. The Elena and Henrik collection had blossomed into reality. Rows of carefully tended plants matched those preserved in the fairy tale book, each labeled with both their scientific names and the story where their preserved ancestors had been found. He'd been invited to speak at a small ceremony, along with Sophia and Carl, about the discovery in his workshop. But first, they had a private moment to visit a special section of the garden. Behind the main greenhouse stood a restored lighthouse keeper's cottage, now transformed into a small museum. Inside, photographs of Elena and Henrik hung beside their carefully preserved specimens and research notes. But the centerpiece was something unexpected: Thomas's workbench from his shop, donated for the exhibition. "It felt right," he explained to Sophia, running his hand along the worn wood. "This is where their story came back to life." The workbench held the fairy tale book in its custom case, open to the Snow Queen. Beside it lay Elena's diary and Henrik's wartime notes. But there was something new, a thin volume bound in soft blue leather. "This arrived last week," Carl said, lifting the book carefully. "From a family in northern Denmark. Their grandfather was a lighthouse keeper who knew Henrik. He kept a journal during the war years." Sophia leaned closer as Carl opened the journal. Inside were more pressed flowers, preserved using Henrik's techniques, and dated entries about his work. But one entry stood out. "April 15th, 1945, Henrik visited today, as he often does when checking the coastal botanical sites. He spoke of Elena for the first time in many months. Love is like these flowers we preserve," he said. "Even if you can't see it growing, it maintains its essential nature. Perhaps somewhere, she's still pressing flowers and thinking of Denmark. He left a preserved sprig of heather in my logbook. Keep it," he said. "Some things are meant to last." That sprig of heather was still there, as vivid as the day it was pressed. Annie, who had flown in for the ceremony, was setting up a small display of her own. The descendant plants she'd grown from Elena's notes had thrived, producing seeds that would now be part of the garden's collection. "Look," she said, pointing through the greenhouse window. In the garden outside, Arctic bell heather bloomed in a wide patch, just like in the old photographs from 1939. The lighthouse that stood in the background was the same one from Elena and Henrik's story. Thomas watched as visitors began arriving for the ceremony: botanists, historians, students eager to learn the preservation techniques. But his attention was caught by two young researchers working together at a bench near the heather patch. She was carefully pressing a flower while he made notes in a blue-ink journal. Sophia noticed his smile, What is it? Just thinking about how some stories never really end, he said. They just wait for the right moment to bloom again. Carl, who had been quiet for a while, spoke softly. Elena once wrote in her diary, "Science is our way of preserving wonder. Like these fairy tales, it helps us believe in the impossible." The morning sun streamed through the greenhouse glass, catching the preserved flowers in their cases. For a moment, past and present seemed to merge. The fresh heather outside, the preserved specimens in their cases, and somewhere, in memory, two young scientists by a lighthouse, discovering how to keep love and hope alive through the darkest of times. On the last day of the exhibition, just before sunset, Thomas received an unexpected package at his temporary quarters in Copenhagen. Inside was an old blue tin box, sent by a retirement home in northern Sweden, with a note explaining that one of their residents had passed away, leaving this with instructions that it should be sent to the Elena and Henrik exhibition. Thomas brought the box to the lighthouse keeper's cottage where Sophia and Carl were gathering their materials. Together, they carefully opened it. Inside was a collection of letters never sent, written by Henrik over the years after the war. The last one was dated just a month before Elena passed away. Each letter contained a perfectly preserved flower, and as they read through them, they realized Henrik had continued their research until the end of his life. October 12, 1989, Carl read aloud. "My dearest Elena, today I finally succeeded in preserving the midnight sun orchid, the flower you always said was impossible to keep. I used your chamomile solution as a base, just as you suggested that last day by the lighthouse. You see, my love, I never stopped listening to you." Sophia wiped tears from her eyes as she lifted out the final letter, dated 2019. "My Elena, the young botanists at the Institute are doing remarkable things with our preservation method. Yesterday, they used it to save an endangered species of Arctic flowers. The seeds remain viable even after preservation, something we never dreamed possible in 1939. You would love seeing how our work has bloomed into new life. I read in a science journal that an American botanist had been preserving medicinal plants during the war years, helping many people. They never mentioned her name, but I knew it was you. You always said science was about helping others. I'm sending these letters to the future, hoping they'll find their way to the right hands. Like those flowers we preserved so long ago. Some loves never fade. Forever yours, Henrik." Thomas carefully closed the box, understanding now why his workshop had been chosen as the place where this story would resurface. Books and letters, like preserved flowers, were vessels carrying fragments of life across time. Annie, who had been quietly arranging fresh flowers for the exhibition's final day, spoke up. "The midnight sun orchid Henrik mentioned, I think we found its descendants." She pointed to a small display case they had overlooked before. Inside was a delicate white flower, preserved using Elena and Henrik's combined techniques, with a small note, "For Elena, who taught me that love and science both require patience. H. 1989 inch." Carl smiled gently. They never stopped working together, even though they were apart. Every discovery one made built on the other's work. As the sun set behind the lighthouse, casting long shadows through the greenhouse, Thomas walked to his old workbench. The fairy tale book lay open, its preserved flowers still telling their story of love, science, and hope. Beside it, he placed Henrik's tin box of letters. Sophia touched the last preserved flower, the midnight sun orchid. Grandmother used to say that some stories are like seeds. They wait for the right season to grow. She paused, looking at the young researchers still working in the garden outside. I think their season has come again. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening sky, just as it had that summer of 1939. In the garden, the Arctic bell heather swayed in the evening breeze, its tiny bells catching the last light of day. Past and present, love and science, preservation and growth, all flowing together in an endless cycle of discovery and renewal. Thomas closed the fairy tale book one last time, knowing that, like the flowers it contained, some stories never truly end. They just find new ways to bloom,